Birds of paradise are one of these groups of organisms that are a natural wonder of the world. They're a real evolutionary and biodiversity treasure that is shared from every inhabitant of planet Earth, and every human can really appreciate them.
The birds you are hearing now are just a few of among roughly 40 different species of the diverse array of New Guinea's enigmatic, remarkable birds of paradise. As the world's largest tropical island with the third largest expanse of tropical rainforest, New Guinea isn't just home to some of the highest concentration of plant biodiversity, but also irreplaceable, charismatic species. It is one of the many reasons why Indonesian NGO Econusa and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology chose the birds of paradise as the symbolic ambassadors to their Defending Paradise campaign to preserve Papua and the Maluku Islands. Unlike Sumatra, which has already mostly been cleared and developed for extractive industries, the island of New Guinea retains 80% of its forest cover, giving it a unique chance at building an economy centered around preserving dense tropical biodiversity that arguably no other nation has. I'm Mike DiGirolamo, your host for Manga Bay Explores, an episodic podcast series from MangaBay.com's global team, where I speak with experts, scientists, and activists from the field working to protect our natural world. Join me for episode 3 in our season featuring the island of New Guinea. This week, I spoke with Bustar Maitar, CEO of Econusa, and Edwin Scholes, founder of the Birds of Paradise Project at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, about the potential for ecotourism in Tanah Papua to replace extractive industries such as timber and palm oil. We discussed the unique birds of paradise and their role as ambassadors, drawing both interest and support to help support conservation efforts, how careful infrastructure development and ecotourism can serve indigenous and local communities, and ultimately offer a different pathway centered around protecting the land rather than degrading it. The sounds you're about to hear are a selection of some of the most unique sounding among the birds of paradise calls. Found only in New Guinea, in so many ways, they personify the island itself, encompassing an impressive array of shapes, sizes, appearances, and especially sounds. From the righteous cry of the bright orange Goldie's bird of paradise, to the otherworldly songs of the curl-crested Manicode. These birds impress and mesmerize conservationists, biologists, and people in general across the world. Biologist Edwin Scholes from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology described to me what accounts for this diversity in both appearance and sound. Amongst these birds, males look incredibly different from one species to the next, more so than the females, as an evolutionary result stemming from mating practices. Contributing to their incredible diversity is also one of the same things that produces cultural diversity in New Guinea, and that is the extreme topography. In total, there are roughly 40 species.
Of those 40 species, most of them, the males of the species, are incredibly different from one another. The way that they look, the way that they behave, and the way that they sound with their, territorial calls and their vocalizations that they use in courtship display are incredibly different, even from two closely related species that we, know about from, DNA or other, evolutionary analysis. Female birds of paradise don't look as different from one another. And so this is something that's been known for a long time, that this is related to the mating system that birds of paradise have. So they are examples of extreme evolution from the process of sexual selection, right? So males are polygamous. They mate with many different females, and the females are the ones who are basically, invested in all of the parental care responsibilities and raising the young. And females are essentially driving the evolution of these traits in males by which ones they are selecting to mate with and be the, parents of the next generation. And this process is what has led to all this extreme evolution in these characteristics of birds of paradise, including the way they sound. So the vocalizations of the 40 species of birds of paradise are as different among the males as are their plumage and their other behaviors. Another important part of this for the sounds they make is that, New Guinea is an incredibly geographically and geologically complex island. And the same reason that we see incredible diversity in other organisms, whether it's insects or plants, other species of birds, and even in human cultures, is because of this really dissected and difficult to traverse terrain. And while we think of birds as being migratory and just able to fly from mountain to mountain, the fact is birds of paradise are sedentary, forest-dwelling specialists. They're fruit eaters. They have this unusual mating system that keeps them tied to their territories, and they don't move up and down their mountains very far, and they don't really distribute across the landscape from mountain range to mountain range. And so this is prime ecological and evolutionary opportunity for creating diversity. And, this has happened all over New Guinea in a lot of organisms, but it's really been taken to the extreme in birds of paradise with things like their sounds.
These birds aren't just beautiful and important for maintaining the biodiversity of the island, but they also serve as cultural symbols of the indigenous communities and the lands they inhabit. They are what Edwin described to me as a natural wonder of the world, an evolutionary and biodiversity treasure. And it's precisely what EcoNoosa and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology hope will bring more conservation attention and funding to Papua. In 2020, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology partnered with EcoNoosa on a campaign they titled Defending Paradise, centered around these birds, leveraging the mystique and the wonder to draw attention to Papua in the hopes of generating interest in conservation.
Birds of paradise have always been this group of birds that are really well known of, but not really well known. People have heard about them. And when I first started working, they weren't common in natural history documentaries like they are now. But they've become kind of one of the most iconic and recognizable groups of organisms that are found in the forests of New Guinea. So, and people universally around the world just find them awe-inspiring and amazing and just interesting. And they're just great gateways for learning about evolution or animal behavior or forest conservation and ecology topics in New Guinea. And so it was a natural fit for EcoNoosa, who was wanting to draw attention to the forests of Tana Papua and the people and cultures of Tana Papua and the larger nature and biodiversity of Tana Papua, to use birds of paradise as kind of that gateway to get people interested in these really beautiful and fantastically interesting birds, and then draw their attention to these other issues going on about how they relate to the culture, their role in the forests, the threats facing the forests, and therefore the birds of paradise too, and so on.
The campaign took advantage of the Cornell Lab's video projects documenting and showcasing the avian creatures, and the response has been positive, really positive.
I've been talking about birds of paradise and by extension, the forests of New Guinea for a long time now, and people, whether they're bird people or not, really love to engage on topics of the natural world through birds of paradise, because they just see them as otherworldly. They can't believe that birds like this exist on the planet and they hadn't seen them before. And to see them in ways, even if they knew what birds of paradise are, to see them in ways that they hadn't seen them before, just really draws people in. And so, the work and a lot of the videos and the material that we've been working with EcoNoosa on really capitalize on some of those same things. It wasn't so much about the birds of paradise, but it was a way of getting people excited by the topic by seeing them and then going to learn more about the biodiversity or the cultures of the forests of New Guinea.
Various video projects produced by the lab on YouTube have millions of views. One video project titled Tana Papua, A Paradise for Birds, has over 11 million views on YouTube as of this writing, and makes a special mention of the Defending Paradise campaign. Other videos highlight subjects such as nature-based solutions to climate change and pandemics, and other videos likewise have generated a comparable amount of viewership. So it's not a stretch to say there's a massive amount of interest directly as a result of highlighting these magnificent birds. So I asked Edwin what kind of impact this has translated to in terms of conservation.
Some of them have been, really successful with their audience in Indonesia and helping EcoNoosa there. There are some that are kind of adjacent to the work with EcoNoosa that have been, very successful in terms of reach globally. In terms of actually impact on the ground, like what has it led to? I think that's part of the process that we're on. Some of the direct impacts are still intangible, and we're working forward with these partners to translate those into more support from funders, more understanding from international, governments and civil society organizations to help with the goals and objectives of forest conservation in Tanah Papua.
The draw of the birds of paradise has brought a lot of attention to Papua, particularly those that want to partake in what is called ecotourism. Australian National Ecotourism defines it as ecologically sustainable tourism with a primary focus on experiencing natural areas that fosters environmental and cultural understanding, appreciation, and conservation. It's a burgeoning market, especially in Papua, but this wasn't always the case, as Edwin notes that in his over 20 years, he saw it grow quite a bit.
So I first went to New Guinea in 1999-2000. Like I said, it's been over 20 years. And at that time, in the parts of New Guinea, mostly in Papua New Guinea early on, there was only a few places that had ecotourism based around forest activities and birding. I mean, there were some pretty intrepid bird or ecotourism groups that went on tours, and there were a few lodges in Papua New Guinea. But at that time, in the Indonesian half of New Guinea, there was basically almost nothing. You had to be incredibly intrepid in those early years. And I didn't first go to Tanah Papua, Indonesian New Guinea, until 2004. And at that time, there was really only one person and one community that you could go with to see forest life and bird life in particular, with a sort of a knowledgeable and supportive ecotourism guide, as we would call it now. And that was a gentleman still doing it, one of the grandfathers of this work, named Zeth Wongor. And he was in the Arfak Mountains of West Papua. And in that time, since 2004, it's corresponded with the work that we've done, sharing the birds of paradise and other work with the world. It has changed a lot. That whole area around the part of the Arfak Mountains where Zeth is has multiple communities now. It used to be just Zeth and his immediate family clan. Everybody else wasn't really on board with the idea of ecotourism or conservation. So it has spread to neighboring villages and communities, neighboring clans. There are multiple lodges and trained guides and people who run homestays and guest houses. And in that part of West Papua, at least, I would say, it's become the major economic driver. Everybody kind of knows that protecting the forest is important for bringing in tourists. And it's mostly birding-based tourists there, although, obviously, and this is true all around New Guinea, that's different coastally for coral reef activity and diving and homestays. And other places, there's interest in orchids or butterflies or cultural tourism. But in this part of West Papua, most of it is actually birding-based. That's driven the tourism, ecotourism scene.
I turned to Bustar Maetar, CEO of EcoNusa, to learn just how much it's growing. If you read Mongabay regularly, you might recall Bustar's interview with CEO of Mongabay, Rhett Butler, from April of 2021. I caught up with Bustar to discuss how things were going since he gave that interview, and to discuss current conservation and land rights challenges, and the potential for sustainable infrastructure, renewable energy, and of course ecotourism for Papua.
My name is Bustar Maetar. I'm the CEO of EcoNusa Foundation in Indonesia. There is a lot of progress happening, especially in eastern Indonesia, in particular in Papua, the island of Papua. Last year, for example, we've been done we call it the permit review process, very focusing on the palm oil plantation in West Papua province. We work with the provincial government of West Papua, supporting by Indonesian Eradication Corruption, or KPK, that's something that we call it. Managed to evaluate all the concession in West Papua province, in total 24 palm oil license, covering like 650,000 hectares of area in West Papua province. And since then, within 6 months, we managed to follow up the recommendation of the permit review that resulting revocation on 16 concession in West Papua province, covering 360,000 hectares. People say that twice of Los Angeles. So, and this is something that Econusa and also provincial government itself and then district government committed to return back the land to the indigenous community in West Papua province. This is something that we've been follow up until today to process the handing out the forest and land to the indigenous community, because there is some process need to be done, like community mapping, indigenous boundaries, those kind of things. In the same times also, we supporting indigenous community to identify what kind of commodity that they can develop, they can grow to supporting their livelihoods. Yeah. Previously also there is 3 companies filing the case to the court against the decision of the district head of district in Sorong, and we managed to defend the case. So the luck is still with the indigenous community, and this is something that we very proud of.
Touching upon the Manokwari Declaration, as you'll remember from the first episode, in order to give locals back their lands, the central government of Indonesia is waiting on proposals from the Papua provincial government, which includes community maps of indigenous lands. Econusa is working with the provincial government to achieve this, putting a significant amount of NGO resources into helping indigenous communities map the boundaries of their land, literally by walking them with GPS devices.
It's a huge area. I mean that the 360,000 hectares that we need to prioritize to do community mapping. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, this is twice of Los Angeles. The mapping that we've been doing at the moment is really on the ground mapping. The indigenous community walk into the boundaries. To taking the GPS coordinate, and then sometimes that takes months really to go around their area. Yeah, the amount of resources that we've been using for the indigenous mapping is quite massive, and then this is something that in the same times also we do a mapping, but in the same times also still find the resources to accelerate the process.
I asked Bustar if he was optimistic that the central government would grant land rights after this mapping process is completed, and he pointed out that local legislation, at least on the provincial level, has been enacted that recognizes the rights of indigenous people, and it offers some level of protection, and it's what allows this mapping process to be conducted in the first place.
Well, there is a local regulation, yeah, in Papua and in the district level. The local regulation is allowing that process to do a mapping and recognize that area as a part of the indigenous community. So we are using the local regulation on that. There is a several example that is already been done in Papua, and but only very few, and especially in West Papua province, the local regulation in provincial level and district level, it should be able to recognize indigenous community land.
For those who are new to this series, we mentioned in the first episode that a piece of documentation called a Hutan Adat is required from the central government of Indonesia to officially declare a forest as a customary land, or an indigenous forest, which officially removes the forest from state control. To date, no forests in Papua have been given this.
Of course, in some degree that the national government should give authorization, yeah, especially when we're talking about the Hutan Adat or the indigenous forest, yeah. But in local level, in the provincial and district level, there is a space for regulation also to recognize indigenous rights. Yeah, so to recognizing indigenous rights, that's something that can be done. Yeah, can be done in the provincial and district level. Just if when the local community would like to give what we call it the Hutan Adat or indigenous forest, that's something that the indigenous community should apply that to the Ministry of Environment and Forestry in the national level.
Bustar does admit that their land can still be taken over by the central government, but the provincial recognition offers some level of protection in that indigenous communities have to be consulted for all development on their land.
Yeah, I mean that there is a still possibility on that, yeah. But at least in the local level, the recognition by the provincial and the district government give the power or rights to the indigenous community to deal with the anyone who came to their forest, yeah, giving their rights that to dealing with the let's say investors if investors come to their forest, yeah. So the possibility is always there.
It should be noted that the Jokowi administration's job creation law, which passed in October of 2020, changes 70 different pieces of Indonesian legislation and cuts red tape for development. This has implications for what regulations surrounding land protection can be enforced. Bustar says the possibility of indigenous land being given to a palm oil company is still possible, especially in light of this bill.
There is still a chance for that, especially also with the current new regulation, the job creation law, where the authority in the central government is growing also. But as you mentioned earlier, the local regulation gives some degree of protection to indigenous community.
It should also be noted that the Indonesian Constitutional Court found the bill unconstitutional in November of 2021, but still gave the Jokowi administration 2 years to amend it, allowing it to remain in place for the time being. As stated earlier, New Guinea is still mostly undeveloped, with isolated communities around the island. A lack of roads and infrastructure make it difficult for a village to sell commodities to outside markets. It's part of the reason why developers in New Guinea have been able to entice villages to give up their lands. EcoNusa is seeking to remedy this, or at least provide an example of how this can be solved, by building a cargo boat to transport goods for communities in Papua to outside markets where they can be sold.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, indigenous communities, they need improving for their livelihood, yeah, and anything that they have in their forest, yeah. There is a lot of valuable commodities that been stuck in the village level because there is no access, there is no transportation, yeah, and this is something that the EcoNusa would like to find a solution, at least to showcase the pilot what can be done to support indigenous communities' livelihood. Currently, we plan to build a small scale processing for taro, which is taro is something that the indigenous community in Papua they use to plant for their livelihoods, but also in the coastal area, in the forest coastal area, this is the gates to the forest, yeah, and then what we can do also thinking to provide access how to bring the indigenous community commodities at least to the collecting point and processing it and and sending it to the market. And this is something that the EcoNusa was thinking since a couple of years ago, to create a cargo boat that can go along the coast of Papua, maybe cannot all the coast, but at least to provide some example what can be done in the community level, yeah.
The boat is not yet completed, but it is in the process of being built. Additionally, it will also be equipped with a drone and provide training to indigenous communities to aid in forest monitoring.
We have building the boat in the last couple of months. It's not finished yet. We still find the resources to make it really happen, this boat, but this is something that we believe will helping indigenous community for their product. But in the same time also we will use the boat for the research and forest monitoring. We plan to put a drone also in the boat to go and then check what's happening in the forest. We will use the boat also for a training platform for the indigenous community. So this is multi-purpose boat that also can load the indigenous commodities, but also doing other things in the same times.
Bustar also spoke about the need to let indigenous communities manage their own waters for fishing, but that they could make more income with support from the cargo boat. In addition to this, power sources are difficult to build and maintain, and Bustar believes solar shows a lot of promise in this regard, especially aiding in cold storage.
If we're talking about the coastal area in Papua in particular or eastern Indonesia, yeah, manage their own fisheries is important. Yeah, this is a very rich biodiversity in the coastal area, especially in the mangroves area. There is a shrimp, there is a fish, many things. Yeah, and then the community with their limitation of production, they just get the what is enough for their livelihood, yeah, without really maximizing what they have. And this is something that we expecting with the cargo boat, and then also support, for example, like solar cold storage, for example, the indigenous community can do more with their natural resources, so they will not depending on the people from outside. Yeah, they can produce their own money. They can produce their own money with support from the cargo boat that we've been provided.
Bustar reiterated that even though the government has its own agenda, especially when it comes to biofuels, remote villages can't be supplied this energy through cables, and they need to be able to produce their own power. He says that solar or any renewable source, particularly microhydro turbines and streams, is a better answer.
Well, of course, government they have their own target, yeah, on biofuel, but also for Indonesia who living in the islands archipelago countries, and then the remote village is along the coast of, especially in the area like Papua. We cannot depending on cable, yeah. So village levels should have their own energy source to supply their needs, yeah. And the only things can be done is through solar panel, through micro hydro, because there is a lot of potential also for micro hydro, and then the others potential, but especially these two, micro hydro and solar panels, yeah.
Getting and replacing battery storage for solar panels is a challenge, but Bustar says microhydro could pick up the slack in this regard, pointing to the success of its implementation in West Papua. Done properly, a single project can provide enough electricity to power roughly 3 to 4 villages for 24 hours a day.
That's something that already apply in the one village that we've been working with, provided like 40 kVA, enough for electricity 24 hours for 3 or 4 villages in Papua.
The conversation turned then to ecotourism. As noted by Edwin, it's transformed a lot in just 20 years, and both Edwin and Bustar see massive potential for it, not just to be a source of income, but to even replace the economic value of extractive industries, and benefit the indigenous populations at the same time.
Well, ecotourism means that the tourism that the giving a benefit for the indigenous community or local people, and in the same times also benefit to the environment that we protect. That's something that we can enjoy for lasting. So by supporting indigenous community to protect the landscape, people coming paying the indigenous community for provide the support for them, but also paying the indigenous community to taking care of their environment for people to come again. That is the ecotourism for me.
Needless to say, getting to Papua is not cheap, and neither is staying there, but the interest level is quite high for those with the resources to make the trip. Combined with the high concentration of unique biodiversity, Bustar says this makes it a great choice for high-end ecotourism.
Well, I mean, go to the eastern Indonesia, in particular Papua, is quite expensive, yeah, and also with the high biodiversity and very fragile environment, massive tourism is not fit with this environment. So what we need is the high-level ecotourism, yeah, people who would like to pay more, spending more time, and living in the limited condition, yeah?
Like the bird ecotourism projects that Edwin mentioned earlier, these aren't large resorts, but simple accommodations that provide tourists with immersive experiences of the natural beauty of New Guinea and Papua. They can encompass a variety of activities, like fishing, for example, or diving, or partaking in conservation projects. Bustar already works with U.S. tourists who pay thousands of dollars to do this.
And then the limited condition means, like not big resort, those kind of thing, but something that is quite simple, because they respect the nature, and this is something that they would like to see. And I've been seeing that the potency for Papua, either for diving, for forest adventure, fishing, I've been because also beside EcoNusa work, also I've been doing ecotourism also. We are hosting people from the U.S. Flying to Papua almost 48 hours just to do fly fish, for example, and they're willing to pay thousands of US dollar to go for fish. So these kind of things, that the potency that we would like to dig more to support the conservation effort, to support the forest protection, but in the same time also improving the indigenous community livelihoods, and also inviting people who can respect nature more, and then and willing to share their money more to the indigenous community.
Pre-COVID, Bustar says there was already a high demand for this kind of tourism in Papua, particularly in two established locations, Raja Ampat and Kaimana, both of which EcoNusa works with. Pandemic aside, the demand is still there, especially given New Guinea's unique landscape, which, as we mentioned earlier, is one of the only places on Earth where you can find a lowland beach and a tropical glacier on the same island.
In Papua, we have one of the last glacier in tropics. This is something quite very unique. We have UNESCO World Heritage, the national park in Lawrence. We have Tamrau Natural Reserve, which is almost unexplored, forest area. Papua also home of the biggest mangrove ecosystem in Southeast Asia. So there is a lot of things that can be explored in this province. Sometimes I'm hosting diving in Papua, and then after diving, they really like the place, and they asking me what the name of the place, and I said there is no name for this place. You can name after you. So you can still do things like that.
The bigger question may be, is this enough to replace the income generated from extractives like palm oil, or at least is the possibility there? And Bustar definitely thinks so, especially if commodities such as taro, a common root vegetable grown in New Guinea, can be commoditized further, and also shrimp if the cold storage issue can be addressed.
I can see that. I can see alternative to support the livelihood and the needed of the indigenous community. It's just the matter of how we organize and how we do it. For example, like as I mentioned earlier, taro. Who think about taro before? Taro have no value. But if we can put the added value there, for example, processing it to become the taro flavor, and then I've been spoken with the several friends saying that there is a potential market for that, then there is a value for that. Shrimp, for example, a lot of potency for shrimp in the mangrove area, and there is no cold storage to collect this shrimp. And then some intervention that we plan to do, for example, building the cold storage and packaging it and finding the market, that will be really valuable for the indigenous community. So focusing on the finding the market, and then adding the added value for the product, I believe something can be really valuable for the indigenous community to support their livelihood, education, health, and the basic need of the indigenous community. If those commodities are managed properly, and then connect with the good and strong market, with the story behind that, when people buying those commodity also helping the indigenous community to protect their forests, I believe that can be done.
While Bustar believes the infrastructure development to build things such as schools or health clinics can be financed through these commodities, roads are still necessary. However, they must be planned carefully so as not to serve the purpose of building more access for extractives, but rather to assist the indigenous communities that need them, Bustar says. The current Trans-Papua Highway, which is a massive 4,325-kilometer road project stretching across Papua and West Papua, and still undergoing construction, isn't an example of this careful planning, Bustar says, and something which, he says, will only invite more environmental destruction.
Road building in the some degree is still needed, to open the access. But what need to be careful is the open the road without any plan. What is the needed for the indigenous community or for the community? So I'm not saying that the road development is not important. That's something important to open the access for the indigenous community. But building the massive road in Papua will just open more space for extraction, for destruction in Papua.
Edwin agrees and elaborates that sustainable road development is a subject of conversation around achieving the goals of the Manokwari Declaration.
Major infrastructure projects are tricky, as I'm sure you've heard before, especially things like the road building in the Trans-Papuan Highway. I think when it comes to something like ecotourism, or birding-based ecotourism especially, obviously it's a good thing in some regard. This is what allows tourists to get access. It's what allows the communities to basically bring the market to them and be able to build guest houses and provide supplies, right? So roads themselves aren't bad in that sense, and roads are certainly part of, a sustainable development plan. I think the thing that we're really kind of at the crux at right now with the Trans-Papuan Highway and for these issues in Tanah Papua is this infrastructure being built and put into place to serve large-scale industrial agriculture interests or mining interests or forest interests, which aren't actually achieving the objectives of the government in terms of sustainable development, or really helping and supporting the indigenous communities that live there. Some cases they aren't all bad, but there's plenty of cases that have been widely reported on in Manga Bay and others where the communities are not benefiting in the ways that they had hoped to, when these companies came. So, roads that could be built to support ecotourism in a smart way, that wouldn't transgress into highly sensitive areas or into national parks, but could support the communities to be able to, make a sustainable living through ecotourism. That would be great. I've yet to see that future, but it's something that's, kind of talked about, I think, at least tangentially, when people are talking about, how to have infrastructure that supports some of the goals of things like the Manokwari Declaration, which is, based around forest protection and the rights and roles of indigenous peoples and, practices of sustainable development.
But achieving these goals is obviously easier said than done. But from Edwin's perspective, there is no better opportunity in the world than the one New Guinea has to take this on, highlighting quite clearly the willingness of the nations in New Guinea. And instead of trying to backtrack into sustainability like so many other areas of the developed world, New Guinea can embrace it now.
There aren't very many places in the world where we are at a place of development where we actually would have that option, that experiment to run, where we could say, our ecosystems are still largely intact. The services they provide to the local people and to the planet at large are still largely intact. They're currently under threat, and yet we have people, the largest stakeholders, in those places, the indigenous peoples who live there, and their, kind of governments and other things that are around them, indicating that they want to take the chance to find the way to develop and achieve their development goals for health and education, but do it in a way that doesn't make the same mistakes that everywhere else did and is doing. And, can that happen in a place like New Guinea, with two very different countries, Papua New Guinea and Indonesian New Guinea? I think we don't know, but the place that I am is that the chance of not trying to get that right in a place like Tanah Papua, where there's desire and there's will and there is seemingly a pathway forward, is too great not to try. And I think that's where we are with, leaders like, Bustar and organizations like Econusa. And, you had spoken with Professor Charlie representing sustainable development and these things from the government of West Papua. They are wanting to find a way to make this happen. And is it an easy equation to replace, traditional extractive industry with, sustainable industry? If there was an easy answer for that, I think we would have seen it by now. And so we know it's not. But there appear to be ways forward because the state of overall development in Tanah Papua is still so low. We're starting from a place that it can actually happen naturally in an effective way instead of trying to backtrack into it like so many other places in the world. There are, other well-known examples where this sort of shift to more sustainable development pathway, has been more successful, not complete, but more successful. A place like Costa Rica, based on ecotourism, lots of conservation, a good model for a place like Papua, and even a model that they say we want to be the Costa Rica of, Southeast Asia or, of the Indo-Pacific region. That being said, it's still very different, right? We all know that, Costa Rica was at a very different level of development when it made that transition, and how much forest had already been lost. And a lot of it's been about, regeneration and kind of bringing those to bear on an existing infrastructure in a way that doesn't exist in Tanah Papua or across New Guinea. It really is a different place and a different opportunity. And to me, that's why it's one of the most important to be focused on, in this equation of forest conservation, biodiversity conservation for these bigger issues, like climate change solutions and so on, because the chance of doing something different in New Guinea exists in a way that it doesn't even in a lot of the other bigger important parts of the world that also have a lot of forests.
And so when speaking about the opportunity for the birds of paradise to serve as ambassadors for conservation, I asked Edwin to highlight a few that he thinks people should know about, or that could draw more attention to conservation, many of which people come to Papua exclusively to see. Among them, he mentioned the Vogelkop superb bird of paradise, the western Perodia, the Arfak astrapia, and he highlighted these birds not just because of their conservation value for the forest they inhabit, but because the birds themselves also illustrate the impacts of climate change.
I'm a bird of paradise scientist, basically, and I get this question a lot about, what are my favorite birds of paradise? But the question of which birds of paradise, I would want people to know about in the context of, ecotourism and conservation opportunities, things like that. I really tend to focus on the species that are, have very restricted ranges, in many cases limited to very small mountain ranges or islands. And then within those ranges, they occupy a pretty specific, often fairly narrow band of distribution of appropriate, habitat in those forests. In places like West Papua, I talked about the Arfak Mountains earlier on for ecotourism. Several species come to mind, like the sort of recently discovered isn't quite the right word, but they're sort of recently reevaluated endemic to the Vogelkop or the mountains of the Bird's Head region, known as the Vogelkop lophorina or Vogelkop superb bird of paradise. Really only exists in the mountains of the Arfak and Tamrau in the Bird's Head region. But there are other birds of paradise that are only found there, like the western Perodia. And then at the highest elevations forests there's a species called the Arfak astrapia, which is only found in the Arfak and Tamrau mountains. And I like to highlight that one, not because its forests are at risk of deforestation from human activity on the ground, but because those forests are at risk because of the same things that are threatening, forests and environment all around the world, and that is global climate change. So, as the earth warms, It's a well-known pattern in montane regions, even in the tropics, where the ecological zones will sort of shift up the mountains. They can't really track laterally with latitude across the landscape. So, a certain type of cloud forest is moving up as the mountain gets smaller, and so therefore less and less suitable habitat moving forward, 50 years into the future for something like the Arfak astrapia. So protecting as much of that high montane forest is really important for ensuring the future of species like that. And those are the species that people are coming to a place like the Arfak Mountains or the Tambarao Mountains to see as an ecotourism. These are the endemic species that if you're a birder, you can only see if you go to those places. So incredibly important.
Centering the conversation around the birds of paradise in the Defending Paradise campaign, Bustar says is a perfect fit because the land itself is paradise.
Paradise means also the landscape itself in Papua. Yeah, the landscape itself is paradise, and this is something that we need to defend. So the bird of paradise is representing the landscape, the beauty of the landscape, but somehow, in some degree, this paradise is under threat, and so we need to defend this paradise.
Bustar noted that New Guinea's forests cover 50% of all existing forests in Indonesia, and he isn't the first person on this podcast to say that losing the battle to protect New Guinea's forests means losing the battle on climate change.
Papua or Eastern Indonesia, Maluku and Papua is covering almost 50% of Indonesian forests, existing Indonesian forests right now. This is our last resort. This is our last standing forest in this region. It's very crucial for the climate. Losing Eastern Indonesia forest means also losing our battle in climate, not only in Indonesia but globally. So people globally should also hand in hands how to protect this forest as much as we can.
And likewise, Edwin says the birds of paradise provide a perfect opportunity for more people to care about not just conservation in New Guinea, but the larger environmental issues we face globally.
Why should we care about birds of paradise? Why should anybody care about birds of paradise? And why are birds of paradise sort of an important piece of the future we're facing around things like the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, and those topics as they relate to a place like New Guinea that has incredible intact forests? And the answer for me is that birds of paradise are one of these groups of organisms that are a natural wonder of the world. They're a real evolutionary and biodiversity treasure that is shared from every inhabitant of planet Earth, and every human can really appreciate them. And they only come from the island of New Guinea, and they're incredibly important to the ecological structure and functioning of those forests. Like I said earlier, they're fruit-eating birds, they're fruit specialists. A lot of the trees in New Guinea specialize on having birds to disperse their seeds. And so if we start losing species that have co-evolved with the trees and the forests of New Guinea for millions of years, we're losing an important element of what is needed to maintain those forests into the future. And that's part one. Part two of my answer is that they're also incredibly important to the histories and the traditions of the people of New Guinea, who have been a part of those forests for many tens of thousands of years in the past, and they're a part of the forest today. And these birds are important symbols of their cultures and their homelands that many of them are fighting to protect and to keep their ways of lives. I haven't been anywhere in New Guinea where the local people don't know all the species of birds of paradise, or at least historically knew all the species of birds of paradise, and have given them names on their traditional grounds. They might call all pigeons in some name, but they'll have a specific name for the different types of birds of paradise because they look so different from one another, and they often are tightly interrelated with the origin stories of those people and their use of the land. And so when we're looking at a world where protecting any amount of intact rainforests is an incredibly important objective to all citizens of Earth right now, But when you have a place like the island of New Guinea that has an extraordinary amount of biodiversity and people, doing something like caring about birds of paradise and doing what you can to protect those forests, I think is something that should be important to a lot more people than it currently is.
I want to thank both Bustar and Edwin for their continued work and for contributing to this episode. Please stay tuned to Mongabay Explores as we continue to uncover the one-of-a-kind species and biodiversity of the island, the challenges and issues that threaten it, and the people, solutions, and organizations working to protect it. The podcast introduction and soundscape is from the Adalbert Mountains in Papua New Guinea. Credit to the communities of Musiamunat, Ivera, and Iwaranai, the Nature Conservancy, and Zuzana Buravalova. Credit to Edwin Scholes and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology for providing the bird sounds you heard over the course of the narration. You can find a list of the birds heard in the intro and outro in the show notes. Mongabay Explores is an ongoing podcast series diving into environmental stories from around the globe. Be sure to check out the first 2 episodes in this season, which highlight the history and culture of the island, as well as carbon credit schemes and illegal logging in Papua New Guinea. If you enjoyed this show, please tell a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep growing. Don't forget, you can find Mongabay Explores wherever you get podcasts, which is separate from our sister series, the Mongabay Newscast. Special projects like this are made possible by our Patreon supporters, so please consider becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. Just $1 per month will help us offset the production costs and hosting fees. And keep up with all of Mongabay's news from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com or get updates via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, where our handle is @Mongabay. Thank you once again, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Mongabay Explores.